It's not.
Somewhere on the side. Yeah, that was fun.
She was discharged.
Yes.
Yes.
No, I think it was just still. It was still, yeah.
That's scary stuff though, when pain comes on like that.
Right.
I know. I hate be like
There's a PowerPoint and a PDF.
Committee meeting of March 15th. And for purposes of history, we have with us from the school board, Dion Manley, Burl Pickle-Antonio, Sue Harn, myself, and Kara Coates. And we have 4 items on our agenda for tonight. And the first is our Economic Development 101. And I will turn it over to you, Treasurer Gooding, to do the preface and an introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess my first official finance
Yes,
facility.
welcome.
Welcome. I had to put the tie back. I had to put the tie back on. It wasn't just a guest anymore. I had to be official. But, no, I'm super glad to be here. I'll get to that. We'll get to that later once we get down into the financial piece. But Marvin Fountains is with us this evening from Baker Tilly. You may be familiar with the name Baker Tilly. They serve as our municipal advisors on the bond issue. Let Marvin tell a little bit about himself so you can understand, his background and experience. Marvin and I have known each other for a very long time. we're very, very young. But Marvin has a lot of experience in the banking world, as a former school treasurer. He's an expert. So when we went through this and looking at some of the topics that we want to talk through and kind of do a one-on-one on economic development, it made a lot of sense to have Marvin come in and help us provide an educational training for the board to kind of get us all up to speed on what the ABCs of economic development are. So with that, I will turn it over to Marvin.
Yes, so good evening, everyone. As we talked earlier, some of you have seen me on a video before when we had meetings virtually, so it's good to see everyone in person this evening. But yes, we worked with the school district. We have worked with the school district, I think since about 2017, on financing of building projects and refunding of debt for the school district. We also get involved with school districts in the area of economic development when it comes to how school districts are involved and how they can be affected through those incentive programs. Typically, I also start off with what we are not. We are not attorneys. We don't provide legal advice on tax incentives. We're not necessarily negotiating on behalf of school districts. Those agreements, most school districts engage outside counsel for that purpose to negotiate those agreements. We do, however, get involved in the financial analysis for school districts when they're being approached about tax incentive programs, how it may affect the school district or the incentives themselves, and in most cases offsetting the loss in taxes or partially offsetting the loss in taxes. So that's our involvement in these particular projects with school districts. And what I put together this evening is kind of a quick overview to just touch on the highlights of those programs that school districts can be involved in or asked to be involved in. Many times school districts get approached with these plans, and then it's a matter of working through what it is the school district may want to consider. What we start with on the first slide that some of you may have, or we can look up to the screen here. Why are these in place to begin with? I kind of want to cover that. What's the purpose? And we've listed a few things here, and a lot of this comes from the way in which the state approaches tax incentives, and not just Ohio, but many states, most all states provide some sort of tax incentive programs. And no different, Ohio provides for them through law, and that's what guides most of the process for the municipalities, the school districts that are involved in those arrangements, primarily designed to stimulate economic growth, promote development, redevelopment of properties, and that are in public interest to do so, in the public interest to do so. So building and maintaining and preserving investment in facilities, preserving jobs, and creating possibly new jobs. That's the way in which they're used or intended to be used. And in most cases, it's a collaboration between the local government and a private entity of some sort with a development or improvement to those types of projects. Next to last bullet point shown here, it is intended for them to be temporary only. We'll get into some of those guidelines as far as and requirements or limitations to tax abatements, but it is intended to be temporary for particular projects, not permanent. And for the most part, incentives are provided through property tax abatements, and that's why school districts are so involved in many cases, because school districts are the entity, the local government, that depends the most on property taxes for your revenue, operating revenue, and for other purposes. That leads us to the next slide as far as, okay, what is the school district involvement potentially? And then again, this is general information. I don't have Gahanna's, we weren't asked or given the task to take a look at all of the arrangements that you have or all the properties or any specific information at this point. So most of this information is general. We do have some specific to the school district, but most of this is overview and kind of general school district information. Again, school districts, as we know, rely heavily on property taxes. So what are the safeguards that are in place for school districts when they're approached with tax incentive plans. Many times, school districts are required to receive notification that there is a planned incentive. In some cases, the Board of Education does have veto rights. We're going to talk about those cases and what those are when they come into play. There are, in some cases, tax incentive review councils that are set up, and there are representatives from the school district sitting on those. Many times it can be the school treasurer, it can be a board member, another administrator in the district. Those are in an effort to review the agreements that are agreed upon between all the parties and assure that those agreements are being met so that, and if not, in some cases, the tax abatement can be discontinued or has to be paid back. And then also in some cases, there is a requirement for municipal income tax compensation to school districts. And we'll get that a little bit later as well. So these are the safeguards, again, that are provided by the state of Ohio to school districts when it comes to tax incentive programs. Specifically for Gahanna Jefferson, again, I don't have specific detail about all the abatements or even all the parcels. That is something that we can get into with doing some work on that. But this information that is provided on this slide was provided in your last offering document for the bond issue. And this is information that is typically provided to the marketplace when school districts are selling bonds, because there is some interest in bondholders, buyers of bonds, as far as what those programs might be, economic development programs, and the type of compensations that may be in place. So no different for other schools. In this case, for Gahanna, about 20 million of total assessed valuation subject to abatements. That equates to about 1% of your total assessed valuation. The abatements range from 50% to 100%, and that's relative to the taxes due on the improvements that are abated. And 6 to 15 years are the range in which they exist. There is additional assessed valuation that are part of tax increment financing districts that the county auditor did not have full information on when the report was put together. So that would take a little bit more information to determine that. But that is information that the county auditor has. In 2020, fiscal year 2020, the school district received almost $8 million in compensation payments. Types of incentive programs that exist in Gahanna primarily are enterprise zone, community reinvestment areas, and tax increment financing. And they are the most, I'd say the most popular, but probably used in many cases in communities. School districts across the state are used to seeing these types of incentives within their community. On the next page, I think we explain a bit about what these are exactly, and this is very high level. If you go to the detail, there's probably at least 5 to 6 pages of explanation. There are some variants that can apply, and we use the word here generally in some cases, just because there are some exceptions to these rules that we lay out here. Enterprise zones are primarily used designated areas for business expansion or location into the state, remote location into the state, and can have some designation of addressing distressed areas. They are required to identify employment levels, what are expected to generate certain employment levels, and they are held to those through those, as I said, those review ways in which those agreements are reviewed primarily on an annual basis to meeting those hiring targets that have been part of the abatement approval in that economic development project. School districts generally are required to approve anything greater than 75% for 10 years. So anything less than that can be approved without Board of Education approval. Just a notice to the school district that this incentive is going to happen at the levels at 75, 10 years or less. Anything over that requires the Board of Education to approve, and in those cases where it is exceeding those limits, there typically are compensation agreements agreed upon to offset that loss of tax revenue that's not being received. And the maximum amount, of course, would be up to the amount, typically up to the amount that is being abated, the tax revenue that's being abated. On a community reinvestment area, slightly different. It's for purposes of revitalization of existing buildings, construct new buildings. Can include housing, residential, mostly though, including commercial and industrial type of projects. Here, the only expected hiring levels are required to be provided and are not specifically required to be maintained or met throughout the agreement. Here again, there's a limit that if the abatement exceeds 50%, the school district is required to approve anything over that amount. And typically a compensation agreement is involved. So, you know, as an example, there could be an abatement granted over 50%, and part of that, what might come to a school district is, yeah, we recognize it's over 50%. Here's a proposal for a compensation agreement that may offset that the amount that exceeds over 50%. So there's anything in between. Again, agreements can make the school district whole as well. So up to the amount that is being abated can be part of the compensation agreement. Tax increment financing, slightly different. I should have pointed out on the tax abatement, the tax payments are being reduced. On a tax increment financing, tax payments are being diverted, and that they're being used to help pay for the cost of infrastructure that it takes in order to attract possibly new development. And that, you know, the first bullet point is it's a way in which public infrastructure financing can take place, primarily used for commercial development. There is limited use residential, but most are used for commercial type developments. The taxes are technically abated, but there are service payments that are referred to as payment in lieu of taxes. I just put that here. It's a little bit in the weeds, pilots, but you may hear that term from time to time, pilot payments. And that's what they represent. These are the service payments that are made in lieu of taxes that are diverted into a fund to help pay for the cost of the infrastructure of that particular development. Those monies can be used to also issue debt in order to pay for those projects. The school district, again, has to approve anything that's greater than 75% for 10 years. And here again, it can be approved up to a longer period of time, the maximums that we have here. But typically there's a compensation agreement in place to either offset that loss or partially offset that loss. What kind of projects can be paid for through that type of an arrangement? Again, this is the public infrastructure part of it. And we list some of those projects that can be used. So you think about maybe a commercial development that needs streets, access to it, water retainage, drainage, lighting, those sorts of things are, if part of a TIF district, are paid that way. On the next slide, this just adds to this. There is a way that the state has provided that school districts can take advantage of revenue streams that come from tax incentives that is provided for by law. And it also requires an approval through the state superintendent. It's Department of Education, and also a certification process from the school district identifying the revenue that's being used to maybe potentially finance the purchase of a building for the school district, even building a building, acquiring land, any purpose in which the school district may have for facilities or otherwise. The revenue stream coming from these payments that are being received through the compensation agreements can be basically leveraged and borrowed against in order to do those kinds of projects. We have examples of that even here in Franklin County of that occurring.
So is that a special kind of CRA?
No, it's the
It's a
same,
different
just as
com-
we described it, those compensation agreements are just used by the school district to identify the revenue streams that come from this. So that $7.9 million that the school district
Right.
receives through those agreements annually
Uh-huh.
can be leveraged, can be borrowed against. So if you have a larger project that is more than 7.9 million, and so you want to build it today but pay it off over time, you can leverage that annual revenue stream in order to do that.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, though, the school district may already have this. I'm not sure in this case, but a lot of school districts have that already being used. And
Right,
so
general fund.
when we talk to school districts, it's more about possibly new projects coming in, or new incentive programs coming in. That,
Yeah.
hey, by the way, you have this option. There's a ton of uses by school districts that are needed. That revenue is needed in many ways
Mhm.
to be used. This is one other way that potentially a school district can use that new revenue that's coming into the school district through those agreements.
It's all very similar to the tax anticipation notes that we've done in the past, except it's your general fund, it's your operating money that's going to be used to pay this back. So it's just another piece. But again, you get the money up front, but then you've got to factor that as an expense going forward to repay that.
And that's limited up to 20 years. Maximum number of years that you can borrow against that is that revenue stream is 20 years. Of course, you have to have the compensation agreements that show you have the money coming in for the next 20 years. And that's the certification process through the Department of Education that takes place in order to.
But for a place like Licking County or someplace
Yeah.
that's going to be affected by Intel, that will have a new huge revenue stream from a compensation agreement or
Yeah.
tax evaded, that would be a perfect tool for them, right?
Yes. Or, other similar type districts doing new projects in their community. And really, so that's kind of the highlights of the way in which the tax abatements take place in Ohio, how school districts are somewhat safeguarded through those and how they can become involved and why they become involved. It's because of the abatement potentially going over those thresholds that are provided through law. The last page is just the kind of a typical slide that we use with schools when we talk about what is the role of the school district in these. And you've probably already had these conversations at some level at some time over the years. So you probably have a better list than possibly this one. These are kind of general as far as in many cases, boards of education may not necessarily have a formal policy in place for economic development, but you can, specific or kind of general, that process can take place at board level to kind of set the groundwork at policy level for the board. Also, the option to maintain flexibility, so not necessarily setting formal policy or real specifics in policy, but maintaining flexibility as you go, as you have projects coming to you. And then there's always different levels of partnership and working with the other local governments that could be involved in economic development from time to time. So a lot of different ways for school district, either Board of Education, some of which is required Board of Education approval. Other part of the role can be through the administration of the school district as far as some of the involvement in those discussions about economic development. And with that, I think we're at the conclusion of the slide.
And one of the things I wanted to piggyback on that Marvin talked about was, especially with all the legislative activity going on downtown at House Bill 126, order revision cases, tax appeals, those kinds of things. Sometimes folks may get confused about looking at property values, especially when it comes to abated properties. But I want to just make sure that everybody here understands as that those still can occur even though these agreements are in place, because what we want to do as the district to ensure that when that abated property comes back online, that it comes back online at the correct value. So even though we may be challenging property values during that 15-year timeframe, 30, whatever that timeframe is, we're doing it to protect future revenue, not necessarily now. So I just want to make sure that folks understand that House Bill 126 and that challenge, that appeal process that has come up every session for
It might be good if you describe what it is, because maybe not everybody knows.
the border revision piece issue is House Bill 126, and it has come up. It's a process, an existing process that works for challenging property values. That if I have a piece of property that's worth, I'm just gonna throw out a big number just so you can see the scope of this, $50 million. But I feel that it's valued at, it's not worth 50 million. It's really valued, I think it's only worth 30 million. I'm going to, as the owner, go challenge that through an existing property through the border revisions. House Bill 126 is looking to alter that significantly. That the education associations, the county auditors associations are all against this bill. So I just want to make sure that folks understand, going back to we're protecting future revenue by doing that. We're making sure that the property values are where they are given an arm's length transaction. So appraisal reports come in. Obviously, you want the value to be as low as you can if you're being assessed taxes on it. If you're selling your property, you want them to be as high as possible. So that's where this whole process works.
Just in that explanation, I guess, can you kind of level set the way that property tax collection works for a school district, in that when a district challenges, it doesn't alter the total amount of revenue that we collect. It's not like we get additional funds.
Correct.
If
It
affects the other property
affects
owners.
everything. Correct. Right. So if somebody's value is overvalued or undervalued, it impacts your neighbor.
Right.
And the county auditor is setting your property values and your tax rates once a year. So if you have something that after that happens, it could impact the revenue in a bad way, depending on where that goes. So we'll enter into settlement agreements to agree on what the property value is, and compensation agreements, which we get into pilot payments. We have 7.9 million that we received as a result of us doing our work to protect our tax base. So we're going to continue to do that now. But most of the time, and I had a conversation today about that process, we do not look at single family owner residential properties. We do not do that. It is primarily residential or agricultural. There will be residential challenges if it is in the form of an apartment complex. It's business. We're going to look at
Commercial.
it's a commercial piece, even though on the tax duplicate it falls under the residential piece. So that's the class 1 res ag, residential agricultural classification is there. So we do that. We have a group, Dillis and Rich Law Group, that do that on behalf of the district. We work with them. So those are some things that we do to, again, protect resources of the district.
But Pearl, were you saying because most of our levies are fixed sum levies,
Right.
that,
It's not as if it results in a windfall to the district.
right,
If we have a
As your
successful
property
job.
value goes up, the
That's
effective
thank
millage
you.
reduces, so that
Right.
therefore it's the old House Bill 920. You're not getting any more money than you were to receive when that specific levy was voted in.
But
Right,
when
so
somebody
it-
isn't being assessed at the correct level, it's that burden is being shifted onto other property
Right.
owners.
single family
So-
residences.
Correct.
In
Yes.
Scott's example of
Right.
50
Mhm.
million being reduced to 30 million, the 20 million gap will be fulfilled by other property owners
Right.
because that person prevailed.
And, right,
And so-
and in Gehenna, that's most likely residential properties,
Right.
right?
And so
That
this,
have to absorb that difference.
Correct.
So
This-
that's,
yeah,
I think that's an
Real-
important point when we
That's
talk
really-
about that legislation, because the way that it has been framed is not really consistent with that understanding of,
it's framed that school districts bully, property owners to.
because we're gonna get more money.
We're
We're trying
not.
to protect our single family residence
Correct.
owners,
That's
right?
And ensuring
When
that
we do
everybody's
that.
paying their fair share.
We're gonna get the
Mhm.
same amount,
right,
right? And
Right, we get the same
So,
amount.
so it's really important for people to know about that bill, because it gets put on the docket again and again. How many years?
Ever since
A couple.
Rob Marin has been in the list.
Yeah. For decades.
Yeah.
Just be real.
Well, the question I have, and I think is what is most confusing for me, is that these three particular economic enhancement tools can be overlaid on each other. So you can have a EZ that has a CRA or a TIF, right? So when I'm studying the various parcels, it's like, oh my gosh, that's part of this CRA and this TIF, and is it also part of an EZ, right? And so is there a hierarchy of which one kicks in, or do we have to satisfy all three of them?
What do you mean by satisfied?
Well, so I guess if I'm the city,
Yeah,
which one of these takes priority
yeah,
with regard to
yeah.
the ORC limitations?
And I don't know, in your specific case for the school district, what areas, parcels, but typically it's the development requesting the certain type of abatement. So it could be either or, not necessarily both or.
So they can only pick one. So the property owner can
In
only
most
pick one of
cases,
these
that's what it is.
enhancements?
Yes, that they have certain areas that may have both opportunities,
Uh-huh.
but there's only one applied. Now,
Oh,
there can be within but however, there's always exceptions to every rule. I definitely know cases where there are properties, parcels in a TIF, so they have a certain amount of revenue that's being TIF'd, but also can be abated within that
so
same
they're
parcel. Can't have more
CRA
than
and
one.
TIF,
Can't have more than one.
yeah. That's
Not
what I
always,
think is very
but not always.
difficult to
Yeah.
try to really understand. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but typically, and if you've looked at the parcels, you don't know exactly which ones you might be looking at there, and with the information that can be obtained from the county auditor can break that out. If
Okay.
there's more than one on it, more than one incentive on that parcel.
Okay.
Just one of the thousands of things that make school finance so
Oh my
complex and
gosh.
confusing. And again, why, and I'm gonna say this from Marvin and the folks like him, keep them in business.
It's
I mean,
amazing.
it's great to have people like Marvin that know the stuff that can be out there monitoring that, and providing advice to the districts to do this, because it's just.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would imagine most districts have a more flexible policy because where you are and where the country and now the world is in an economic cycle will be very much a driver in how you approach these. So to set a policy and leave it in place for 20 years would be a really bad idea, wouldn't it? I mean, I believe our policy is flexible, right? Because we're looking at it in the economic cycle that we're in to
Yeah, I think many policies kind of could be said that way too. You don't want to tie your hands too much, or formal policies aren't intended to be addressed every 2 months, right? New policy, being changed every 2 or 3 months. So if there is a policy, it's generally pretty general when it comes
Right.
to the tax incentive that school districts may get involved in. So most are not, most specific if there is any at all.
for that reason, keep it flexible.
Yeah, and I think it'd be important to constantly evaluate those policies to make sure that they're doing what we intended them to do.
Right.
I would never advise that we approve a policy and let it sit there, which is something we're constantly looking at, making
Absolutely.
tweaks to, or write them when they have certain triggers in them to force us to respond to.
Absolutely. Okay. Anybody else have questions?
I think this was pointed out that legislatively, what Scott was explaining could change tax abatement law can't, or,
Oh, yeah.
restrictions or what can be done, what can't be done. There's been legislative.
Wasn't there one being proposed right now that came through on the OSBA?
There's been recently to
Mhm.
allow, to take up those limits.
Yeah, they're
Education,
increasing these, right.
The district doesn't get involved Get involved at a higher level.
Yeah.
sort
It
of thing.
hasn't
So-
passed yet, and
Right,
hopefully,
right.
you know, the OSBA and the school management as their
Oh, as well.
OASBO, hopefully they will be representing the districts and saying, keep them at the current levels, right?
In the association, so you've got the Ohio School Board Association, BASA, or Buckeye Association of School Ministers, and then OASBO, the Ohio Association of School Business Officials. Those three are all at the table, or all down at City Hall, all negotiating, testifying together as a unified front, which is good.
Good,
We're
yeah.
all working together on that.
Okay.
I'm just trying to understand how, because the abatements have to do with the city, how does that, I'm trying to get to the beginning of why this conversation is happening with the abatements and how it affects the school. And maybe it's just a general understanding of how this process works and kind of what we're talking about here.
So we as a school district, if the city wants to give an enhancement that's greater than Ohio Revised Code allows, they have to come get our permission to do that. So it would be giving up property taxes with a CRA, or redirecting the property taxes in a TIF. And so that's why we're having this discussion, because one of the things that is in our future is the city has asked us to renegotiate the current compensation agreement that we have with them.
Okay.
And so getting a basic understanding and education on all the different nuances is
Okay,
kind
so
of
they're
what
already
we started with today.
Okay, they're already asking for that, and so it has to be discussed.
Yeah,
Okay. that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
Well, and
So we have new board members, you know,
Gotcha.
we just started ground zero.
Thank
and
you.
into the education.
Thank you.
And that's
We're all-
exactly what I was
we're
gonna
all
say.
just a little confused.
Yeah,
I thought maybe I missed something at the very beginning, but I wasn't paying attention. So,
yeah,
thank you.
that's why. Yeah,
Yeah, three new board members that started January, and the new treasurer started 2 weeks ago. So
Yeah.
it's kind of just an educational piece. And I think for me, you know, as the CFO, I'm hoping that we'll be able to do some of those educational things here in this committee that, you know, talk about tax incentives, talk about, you know, we'll come up with something fun. I've got an idea for school finance 101, but we'll let the cat out of the bag on
That
that.
sounds like
Get your- Bring your popcorn.
Stay tuned.
Put a little teaser out there. Or we're just, you know, using this as an opportunity to have an open, honest conversation about those and talk about, you know, the complexities of school funding, because it's
it's a lot.
a lot.
It's a
So
lot.
we're gonna take small bites out of the apple, but
Right.
we'll
Yeah.
get there.
Any other questions? No? Good. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for
Very
coming.
helpful.
Yes.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
I may stick around to the next couple of topics here.
You're more than welcome to, or, you know, but-
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
Okay, and second on our agenda is the Phase 2 construction update, and our owner's rep, Mark from Turner Construction. Well, do you want to lead in, or do you want to go for it?
Do you want to?
Anybody want to do a
So,
intro?
Sue and Daphne and Mark and I met, and we wanted to kind of talk about what would be the easiest way to report out at our finance meetings, the progress of all 6 of our projects. And so we put our heads together. Sue and Daphne gave us great feedback, and then Mark came up with a dashboard that we will, on a regular basis at this meeting, share where we are. Right now, we're making a lot of headway on our elementary schools. We're in design development on all 3 middle schools and our high school. Jennifer Davey from DLR is here to answer any questions about our projects, but then, you know, Mark, I'm going to turn it over to him for the presentation of the dashboard.
Sure. So what you're looking at here is the high school dashboard. With each update, we'll have an updated image in the upper left-hand corner.
in our folder by any chance.
I can send it to
Oh.
you guys.
That would
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
fantastic.
Okay.
You can't see that? You
I
got the
cannot.
Well, I'm not going to
I
go
can
over
see that.
the site plan. It's just,
I can't.
yeah.
If there's a way to put it in the shared folder, that would be lovely.
Yeah,
Or if you
um,
email it. to
Yeah, we
me,
can do that next time. but
Yeah,
I'll
we'll
send it
definitely
right
do
now.
that
Okay.
next time.
Thank
And
you.
I'm not going to go through, whatever imagery is up there, it's really just to kind of frame your mind as far as which project we're talking about.
Yeah.
And when there are projects under construction, such as the elementary school, obviously we'll have some progress photos in a collage, which you'll see here before too long. But the blue tables in the center at the top are just kind of like the baseball card statistics of how we're doing on each project, where we're talking about the completion date, what was our starting completion date, what did we report last time, and then where are we projecting. So those are the three columns going across the top. And then you also have the construction costs. In the high school construction costs, originally was $158 million, and we are still at $158 million. The reason for that is we exercised a high degree of discipline through the schematic design process to make sure that we hit those targets despite the ever-changing economic climate that we're working inside of. For the two tables below that, the stadium and the demo and parking, so there's going to be several interim milestones related to the high school that are of public interest. So we wanted to offer that level of detail because we know the stadium's important and it's kind of the first thing that's going to be turned over. The academic building will be next, and then we have to tear down the existing high school and redevelop that site. So I'm sure there's some curious folks with an interest in that particular scope element. So DD officially kicked off in February. We're well on our way. We've had a variety of user group meetings, both related to inside the classroom, but also related to the site. We are close to having a 50% DD package, which will be issued, I believe, in a matter of weeks here, late March, early April. One of the things that's not on the schedule on the bottom half is a budget check. Because of the climate that we're in right now as it relates to supply chain issues, labor shortages, things of that sort, we really felt it was important to have a stress test on how things were progressing at the 50% DD point. Now, this is something that we'll see where we are. It may warrant us to have a value engineering process and redirect things, but because things are changing so rapidly, we really felt it prudent to be financially, have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that we're honoring those targets and making sure that we are designing a building that we can indeed afford without having to subsidize the budget or take other drastic measures.
The other part of that is making sure that we're looking at things 50%. So we're not waiting until the last minute to have input from key stakeholders before we get too far down the path. Right?
Yeah. So the traditional process is to have a milestone estimate performed at SD and at DD at the conclusion of DD. And you see that in the Gantt chart schedule at the bottom half of the schedule. So but what we decided to do was actually have a budget check at the 50% DD mark, just to, belts and suspenders basically approach on construction costs. A couple of the notes on the right-hand side there. As I mentioned, we've been having user group meetings. We also had a great meeting with the city a couple weeks ago. The mayor was very gracious and brought in her staff. We sat, I'm not sure if it was this room or downstairs, but we had a big meeting here at Clark Hall. We talked through our expectations, our mutual expectations. What is our communication protocol? What are our deliverable expectations? It was a really productive meeting, and really happy to see things get started on the right foot with the city of Vienna. One of the things that we committed to as a team is to actually have bi-weekly coordination meetings. Our next one is next Monday, and we'll be having those meetings every 2 weeks. And it's really designed to make sure that there aren't any surprises, that we're streamlining the process, that there aren't any hiccups and that any hurdles that may be encountered, we're trying to get out in front of those and address those before they become a stumbling block. Any questions on the high school? Okay.
Mark, I have a question of the date, the completion date. Last reported, if I remember correctly, was August.
For the building?
Yes.
Yeah, well, if you recall, we had a conversation
Yeah.
about that,
Oh,
right?
I do.
And,
This
but-
makes me much happier. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had misspoke in that meeting
Good.
with August. And I felt I addressed it in the actual finance committee meeting, but I may not have. But the turnover date is scheduled for June. To
Good.
give July and early part of August time for activating the building without
Yeah.
the students.
Actually, I think you had the FF&E date
Yeah, I did,
in
yeah,
July.
yeah.
And so this date, that stuff will still be going on, right? Or-
Yes, yeah, there'll
so
still be furniture move-in and
in July, right?
and all the other beakers
the
and microscopes and stuff coming in.
Construction
Construction is completed.
Not
now.
16.
moving. It's
Right.
not gonna be.
Yeah,
So construction complete and certificate of occupancy, 2 different dates.
they are, they are.
Okay.
And the reason for that is the certificate of occupancy, your inspectors are gonna wanna see that there are clear egress paths with furniture.
Oh, right. 'cause we have to move
So
all
they wanna
furniture
see
in.
the
Okay.
furniture in place before they'll give you the C of O.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about the confusion.
No, well, I'm just thinking, as we end one academic year, we're gonna have to engage the teachers on some level in getting stuff from one building to the other. And I'm just trying to envision timeline-wise when that might happen.
Yeah,
Not that we have to answer that question now, but it's just good to be thinking about that
yeah, yeah,
and how that is
indeed.
gonna happen.
And we just did that with Lincoln Elementary.
Right.
So we have a little bit of practice, a little bit smaller than the high school.
Well, yeah, I mean.
But we have practice.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's good practice.
Yeah, it's the same methodology,
Yes.
right?
yeah, it's just scaled up.
Right.
And I actually have one other question. It's actually more related to the plans than it is the timeline. And that is with the Master Facilities Planning Committee, are we going to be able to have a chance to react to, I know that you've been having some meetings with the teachers and so on, so I'm sure that there have been some changes made as a reaction, as a result of that.
Mhm.
Will we be able to have a chance to react to the changes? And
You want to talk about the user group meetings? Like we've had some almost.
Sure. We've had several user group meetings and have engaged with, 50+ staff members about the various parts. And you're right, based on feedback, there have
Sure.
been some updates
Sure, yeah.
that have been made. And it's funny, we got together with someone today to take a look at the plans, and the ones that I had, I said, these are about 15 iterations behind because of the updates. But I think probably in an upcoming steering committee meeting, we could take a look at, kind of where we are with things and the changes we made based on the feedback.
Yeah.
In areas like the performing arts area, the arts classrooms, some of the business classrooms.
all
things like that.
areas.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Some
because
areas haven't changed.
I'm not
but-
sure where walls fit in, if walls fit in DD or FFE, but it sounds to me like probably DD.
Mhm.
But walls are so important when you're teaching, because if you can imagine being a 15-year-old like in this space and trying to learn when there's, applause happening and janitors going down the hall with, rolling noisy things and stuff like that. So just try as a teacher thinking through learning spaces, it's very important to understand the functionality of each individual room is going to be. And you can probably determine some level of that on, 2D representation.
Sure.
So I
Yes,
just want to make sure that we're staying way ahead of that.
So I think it's important to give our team a lot of credit. Jill's leading on effort with these user group meetings. Like I think you've almost had almost 30 of them where you're sitting down with art teachers, music teachers, theater teachers, and you're going through what would you like to see in these spaces. So it's really the nitty gritty of how it's going to look. And then, you know, sometimes it's saying, well, we may not be able to afford all of this, but we'll try.
Right, yeah.
You have to value engineer it out if you can't, but it'll approximate what they would really like to see. And they have a real opportunity to give their voice to the project. And, you know, this feeds into what we've been talking about for a while, which is BOLD, where there's an executive committee and teachers can go through their representative in that committee to talk about what they would like to see. And then one of the reasons we hired DLR is they not only kind of shepherd the process of how we would like learning to be and how we would like to use it in the new design, but they come back once the building is finished and they kind of help us navigate through its use. So all of this is connecting the dots, and it's a lot of detailed work.
Yeah, and I would say specific to your questions about the walls, those are things we've been discussing in user group meetings. We've had teachers say, we really want an operable wall here because we want to open up when we have guest speakers. We've had other people say, you know, this isn't really the right place for an operable wall, or I love glass, but I want it frosted, you know, that type of thing. So yeah, those are part of the conversations right now as well, and continuing.
And the only reason I asked the question is because I know open design is very forward thinking and all of that, but it also has to function, you know?
Sure.
So.
Well, and I think
as a teacher.
at the 50% DD mark would be a great time to daylight those drawings to the steering committee.
And what we had talked about a couple weeks ago was once you got the Gantt chart with the key decision dates.
Yes, yeah.
We would make sure that we had steering committee meetings right after that. Like we would line up all the different meetings to make sure that we had enough time to have steering committee meetings, then the next finance committee meeting, the right board meeting. So Mark has that on his list to make sure the dates kind of fall out once we know when the 50% mark is going to be made.
Okay, I just want to make sure we're staying ahead of everything.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, it would be great to get the steering committee input at the 50% mark so that by the time we finalize the DD, it's been taken into consideration. And if it's determined to incorporate it, then it would be made so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know the last meeting we talked about the traffic. When I'm looking at that, the school being done in the summer of 2025 and the parking not being done for a whole nother year, what does that mean parking will look like during that year? That's a whole school year. Have we thought about, I mean, I'm sure we have. What is that going to be like?
A mess.
Well, it's going to be a pain point for sure. I mean, I can't sugarcoat it. It's not going to be fun. But what we're talking about with Russilli is how can we potentially expedite the demolition of the existing high school and at least get some kind of base there for parking for that for as much of that school year as we can down. We're still working through that. The site is still being developed, but we understand that it's a sensitive issue, and we're going to do everything we can to mitigate the pain.
Is the main entry like for traffic through the south, like from Rockport?
No.
No. So all of the entry points are going to be off of Havens Corner and off of Hamilton.
So there are just many multiple.
Yeah.
And then is that the complete site? Like, so all practice fields and athletic fields besides the stadium are going to be located at
Blackwood. That's
So
correct.
there'll be less people practice every indefinite.
Yeah, so teams are now baseball team, soccer team, so that's been happening for a
All
long
teams
time.
will be. So
Well, the teams that would play like soccer,
Tennis,
the change would be,
Soccer, lacrosse, tennis, and baseball and
Yeah.
softball will be at Blackwood.
yeah.
Track will
Track cross country.
practice at West, right?
Oh,
gonna
you're
be
talking
south.
about in the interim.
South.
Yeah.
South, okay. Yeah.
So only stadium sports will be
Yeah.
practicing here, everything else is.
Yeah, so it's important to note that soccer is already practicing there currently, and as is baseball. So the additional will be tennis, softball, and then lacrosse. But I think lacrosse is going to be able to play most of their games in the stadium practices there. So
You mean long-term?
Long-term,
yeah.
yeah.
One other quick question, just scheduling. So construction documents are continuing through site construction and stadium construction?
That's correct. Yeah, we will start at the site and stadium before we complete the construction documents on the building itself. The stadium documents will have been completed before we start construction on the
Three
stadium.
projects in that one. lot.
Yeah.
Because if anything changes, there's no room for change. If
Yeah, the construction documents, it's not to suggest that the stadium isn't going, the stadium documents aren't going to be completed until 12/8. There's a lot more activity and interim milestones inside that single bar. The stadium document completion date, hang on, I have it here. Schedule.
And what your concern is?
just, if anything needs to change with the site. Construction documents are being worked, if the construction documents are still being worked on while the construction is going on, in my mind, you would want the construction documents to be done, completed, all changes to be worked out before you start actually building.
Yeah, well, that will be the case for the building itself. Okay.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of other things within.
Yeah,
that.
so
There's three parts of
the
it.
stadium documents, the construction documents for the stadium and the site will be completed right around Memorial Day. Or late May, early June is what we are forecasting. And then that will allow us to buy that scope out, get the subcontractors on board, get a GMP, a guaranteed maximum price in front of the board so the construction can commence right around Labor Day. Okay. Now, if we didn't do that, if we waited until everything was documented 100%, we wouldn't be able to deliver the building in 25. We would have to wait until the following year.
It makes sense, but
Yeah.
it just, it's.
This schedule here is a very simplified schedule, and it's condensed. There's pages of 1,000 line item schedules that, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there's a lot more detail behind this, behind these bars.
The purpose of this schedule is just to give a high level overview so that
It's a dash.
it's a dashboard.
So as you get further in, will you provide a more detailed, these are the construction documents, these are the site documents, these are stadium documents, these are the buildings, so that you can see that, okay, we planned this out,
Yeah,
and then we're gonna work on it, not that we're planning as we're working. That's what, to me, that was my concern, is that you're planning as you're working,
Yeah.
That's not.
and,
Yeah.
without those more specific bars, it's hard
Right,
to tell. So
right.
that was all.
yeah. One of the things that at SD, we needed to lock down where the building was going to get situated and some high level site concepts so that we do not have a potential change impact some of those early design document packages, such as the stadium site foundations, even the foundations and the structural frame for the building will precede that December completion date for the construction documents. The December completion date for the construction documents really pertains to paint colors, carpet specs, the real fussy stuff inside inside the building.
And Mark, one of the challenges is working through the supply chain issues because of the pandemic, right? So
Yeah.
trying to order steel beams 14 months out is really, really important.
Yeah.
Electrical gear, switch boxes, right?
Yeah.
Roof decking. So
Yeah.
we have
Roof
to have those
insulation.
construction documents done so that those orders can be complete, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's just the high school.
That's
Yeah,
nice.
that's,
And then you drive the dashboard.
I
Dashboard.
love the dashboard.
Okay, good,
Love
good.
it.
I'm glad. That's good. All right, let's see how the middle school goes. All right, so same concept on the middle schools. The middle schools are a little simpler in that they don't have as many interim milestones that we need to track towards. So what we have here is the Middle School West up at the top. Our completion date remains the same, which is April of '24. The construction costs, you can see that originally it was $9.29 million. In the last report, the construction cost was reported at $10,765,000. Since that time, there was a prudent decision to relocate the clinic next to the administrative space. And before, they were disjointed. Making that design change does impact the cost of the project to the tune of about $75,000. So it was decided to go ahead and raise that target budget for Middle School West to provide for that change. Middle School East and Middle School South remain the same from what was reported last month from a completion and cost perspective. Here, user group meetings continue to take place. Our DD package is actually expected to be in our hands for DD pricing by the end of this month. The other thing that, kind of along the lines of what Steve was talking about earlier, as it relates to supply chain issues, the other thing that this DD package is going to be coupled with is an early roof insulation procurement package. Roof insulation is one of those long lead items, and we can't wait for the design to just continue to evolve before we get that on order in order to hit these dates. So DLR was gracious enough to expedite a roofing insulation package for us. Yeah. So the month of March is when, the month of April is when we will be performing that DD cost estimate. And hopefully there isn't a significant amount of value engineering, but we'll see.
So are we thinking that we'll be able to look at the middle school DD and the high school 50% at the same time for like the steering committee meeting?
Yeah.
Is that our hope?
Yeah,
Okay.
and Rustilli has two different teams
Okay.
dedicated to their pricing. They have a high school team and then they have a middle school team. So from a resource perspective, they shouldn't be stacked up and prolong the effort.
Okay, good.
Any middle school questions? All right, great. All right, elementary school. So when we started out with Blacklick and High Point, everything was aligned with each other. Okay, but it's been a
I
bit
thought
of
it was
a,
going to be so simple.
I know, right? But it is a tale of two projects, unfortunately. So in our last meeting, we had reported, I've got a typo in the construction cost from the last report on Blacklick. I'll get that corrected. But we had reported that there were some budget overruns relative to the final CD set and how the market responded to that CD set. We have since, now we are also reporting that we have some realized costs as it relates to unfavorable soil conditions on both sites. And that's why you see the current cost projection at 10,670 for Blacklick and 10.8 for High Point. One of the things that we're doing to mitigate those costs is we have launched into a pretty extensive value engineering process. About $350,000 has been accepted to help mitigate some of those costs. There are still about $700,000 on the table. I don't feel like we'll be able to get even half of that, just because of how what the ideas are, the timing of them, and a whole variety of other reasons. So we're kind of taking it on the chin here at the elementary schools, unfortunately. One of the reasons is when we move fast, we try to expedite this to get the academic buildings online as quickly as possible. And just the pace, unfortunately, has lent itself to some of these circumstances. All that being said, Black Lake is progressing nicely. We're out of the ground in Black Lake, which you can see in the 3 photos on the left side of this dashboard. Momentum is finally picking up on the elementary school. So on Black Lake Elementary School, which is why there's a higher degree of certainty on its completion date of February of 2023. Now, just like the high school, there are interim milestones that will be turned over, with spaces turned over before February of 23. The academic building is going to be this fall. The administrative renovation will be this summer, and the arts will be in the winter. So there's a higher degree of certainty because the biggest variable with construction is the grounds, and we're out of the ground. Okay, we're also out of the winter weather. So momentum building on Black Lake. At High Point, yeah. On High Point, you can see on the right-hand side, this picture is just a day or two old, but we're not yet out of the ground. We're still going through a soil stabilization process. And it's frustrating for all of us.
Can you go in, just out of curiosity, what is the soil problem?
So the soil problem, there's a lot of organics in the soil. It appears as though when they cleared the site to build the building, they just knocked over the trees and just buried them. So all those organics are just decomposing, and it's unsuitable to actually bear on.
And it's pretty,
Yeah. So when you say organics, you mean trees, right?
Trees, yeah. Trees and shrubs and bushes. Yeah. It just makes
We had to
it.
go down 8.5 feet.
who is that? Can we go talk to them?
We already asked those questions.
Thanks a lot.
No, we don't know who left the organics.
Yeah.
And a lot of it we've had to remove because it just doesn't work.
Right.
So then, and it's 8.5 feet, we had to go down to remove a lot of that on the building pad. So then we have to come back in and stabilize the soil. We hope to have the pad built by the end of the week, if not early next week, which then gives us more confidence of when we can get the rest of the stuff done.
Is that whole area had to be cleared out when they
Before
built
they
High
built
Point?
trees, yeah.
Well,
It
when
was
they built
woods.
High Point, that was all woods. So all of that had to be originally cleared out. So some of it
That's why
is
it's
the.
so deep.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
yeah, sure. Once we are out of the grounds, then a higher degree of certainty on the construction schedule can be provided by Russilli. That's why we have an asterisk next to the High Point current completion date. Okay, still subject to change until we get through this week. I'm trying to think what else. I think those are the highlights for the elementary school.
Ask what things, or that you could, if you don't want to answer this question now, it can always be, framed in an email, and that's fine. But what value engineer, what things are on the chopping block, I guess, for the elementary schools?
I don't have the list in front of me,
Okay,
but I'm happy to share that.
that's why I framed the question
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
There were probably 30 or so items that were offered up. Some were no-brainers, some were no ways, and you have everything in between.
And somewhere we need more information.
Somewhere we need more information, exactly.
I have a couple of questions. So I have kids at High Point, and I went to the PTA meeting just last week. And maybe like the week before that, we got an email sent out from the PTA asking the parents for supplies inside and outside recess equipment, an Amazon list, and it was reported that like, I think it's like parents chipped in like $2,000, and the PTA covered like $5,000. I'm guessing, obviously, like that's never going to be reimbursed to High Point. Most of it was for inside recess things, since the children have not been able to go outside to play because of disruptions. That was my question number one. Question number two is High Point has, well, had an amazing climbing wall, and PTA is wondering who's going to cover the cost of installing a climbing wall in the new gym. That will be a pretty, I mean, it might not seem like a big ticket item, but for PTA it would be, you know, it's not going to be millions of dollars, but for a PTA to, you know, get the funds together to do that on something. I mean, obviously we're grateful for a new gym, but to cover the cost to replace or to put it back. I don't know if they can reuse the old climbing wall, like the materials, and just have it reinstalled. So I just wanted to throw those two things out there as a High Point parent.
Scott, do you know about reinstallment of the equipment that's in?
Yeah, we're looking in to see if we can reuse that equipment and make sure it's safe. We don't have an answer for that yet. So as soon as we find out, that'll help us know where we're going at.
Climbing was part of the PE curriculum, right? Or is
In
that
some
it?
schools, not all schools have it.
Not every elementary school has a climbing wall.
Typically, they have been installed by PTAs and.
I think it was, I mean, originally at High Point. So I think they're trying to look ahead, like the walkathon is our big fundraiser.
Yeah, sure.
And they're thinking, if we're gonna have to pay for this, we're gonna have to, you know, essentially fundraise double what we usually do to put the funding wall back up. So
We'll have to have more, we'll just have to have more discussions about the process and when we find out information about the equipment and, you know, so that we can help plan forward with that.
I just wanted to put it out there.
Thank you.
Trying to think ahead.
That's good.
It's very good.
Okay. Anything else on the middle school? I may have jumped the gun there on slide progression or elementary. Yeah. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes,
Were you going to talk about the athletic?
That's the next.
Yeah, that's the
next
next.
slide.
Yeah, that's the next slide here. And this is the last slide too. So the first thing, this is pertaining to the Blacklick Athletic Sports Complex. This drawing is made a little larger, so I thought we would just have a minute or two talking through what the scope of this project is exactly. And what I was going to do is actually start here at the bottom and then just work clockwise around the loop here. So Blacklick Elementary is just to the south. On what you're seeing here, and this is a solar field, right, Scott?
Yes,
It's a
it
solar
is.
field. So just to the east of that solar field is going to be the proposed location for the tennis courts. 10 tennis courts oriented in the north-south direction. There's also a small restroom building there.
Restroom and storage.
Restroom and storage identified as building C. Okay. Parking is going to be added along those tennis court lots, which you see to the south, as well as this drive and the entrance point. These two baseball diamonds are already existing, and there's no scope plan for those baseball diamonds. Working our way to the north, building B is a pre-engineered metal building that is intended to be indoor batting cages. And some storage potentially, try and get as much use of that as we can.
It'll have turf inside. They can lift the cages up so they can actually do some drills. Any
Fielding.
yeah, fielding, throwing, running.
How many square feet? Looks little.
Yeah.
It looks a little there.
Yeah.
I believe it's
Like hit a home
100,
run easy.
it's 100 feet by 80 feet,
Oh, wow.
so.
Yeah,
Doesn't look like
it's-
that at all.
No.
yeah, no, yeah,
And it will be used by baseball and
and
softball.
softball, yes. This rectangle immediately to the north is a practice field. This kind of ovally looking shape here, the rectangle with rounded corners, I'm not sure what
We
that's
like
called.
a flocka.
Blocko, yes. This is a detention basin. So we've got, we have to manage all the stormwater for this site, and this is one of the mechanisms to do that.
Well, wait, there's, part of the field is in that.
Yeah, that's, yeah,
So that field,
That's a little bit of a problem.
so that field is gonna
it's not
be,
wet.
it's gonna be a multi-purpose, so
That
it
corner
can
slope.
change, it's not gonna be used for any competition, but it's more if there is a soccer tournament out there, they could go over in that area and warm up and practice. So we're gonna work on drainage
Mhm.
so that, what part of our issue out at Black Lake is it doesn't drain well.
Yeah.
And that's what the detention pond's gonna help us with. So that other field will be just used to practice, warm up.
And that could be for baseball, softball, or soccer.
Yeah,
Or the
lacrosse,
Any
we
field.
do have a lot of youth groups that go out there, so they could use that smaller area to work in. So
So like we're gonna actually line it, or it's just gonna be a grassy field?
it'll be a grassy field that we could line if we really needed.
Okay.
Yeah,
Clarify something.
yes.
You said it's not wet. What does that mean? Is it just under normal circumstances, it's grass, but when it rains really hard, it's a place for water to go?
Yeah.
Right.
That's my
So it's
understanding.
not normally a pond.
Right.
Just out of curiosity, I know this is a different subject than this, but is the high school one the same way where it's normally dry or is that always?
We're still working through the storm detention strategies. There are some, surface detention is way less expensive than underground detention. I think there is one consideration to have a wet basin of some sort. But for the most part, I think it's intended to be dry surface detention, where you have just in a significant rain event, it's detaining the water.
That's what I needed to know. And the reason why I say that, because every time I see a detention pond, I'm thinking that's something to manage if it has water in it on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And when I say manage, geese
Yeah.
and skaters, what I
Yeah,
mean?
sure.
Trying to keep people from skating on it.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah.
Just from a safety standpoint.
Mhm.
So, if it's a wet pond, that's a whole different thing than if it's just a hole with grass.
Right. Absolutely.
So, I mean, obviously, if we had to choose between two, I'd rather see the hole with grass that occasionally fills in when it rains really hard and then it goes away after a day,
Mhm.
so.
Mhm. Yeah. So I believe that is the intention, the latter, with this particular space right here. And this doesn't necessarily need to adhere to this shape. It will likely take a different shape to also get free and clear of the field. All right. Moving our way further north, we've got two softball diamonds. And here again, you've got a building A, which is a kind of a press box it's a two-story building, press box up, storage down.
Concessions?
So what we'll do is we'll just pull a tent out and then put a table out for concession. We
How about
really haven't
electricity?
seen, I'm sorry.
How about electricity?
They would have electricity if they needed it, but doing hot dogs, we really haven't seen, hot dogs, hamburgers, things.
There's
like
not
that.
electricity out there yet. Is there by the
No,
school?
we'll have to put it.
We'll have to
out.
put it, yeah.
Yes, that'll be a part of it, because you'll have to have electricity for the press box, running the scoreboards, things like that.
Well, we use this for tournaments, right? Like, and so concessions is how you pay for your umps and support. So if we gotta think about it.
Okay.
I agree.
Yeah.
Because the boys have a very nice concession stand.
Yes.
So as promoters for girls and the sports over there, I think that would be,
Yeah.
now's the time to look at it.
And what about the rest? Because I know there's a restroom by the tennis courts for the coming up.
There are restrooms at the underneath.
Yeah,
Part of that building is storage and the other
Oh,
part
got it.
is restrooms underneath.
yeah.
So,
Okay, now moving our way east, we've got 3 fields that are proposed. The center one is the one that would receive synthetic turf. And I know we'll probably have a little discussion on that, but just below that center field is building D, which is a restroom and storage facility. And obviously a lot of parking being added to support all 3 of those fields and the softball diamonds. The documents for this particular project are moving super fast. These buildings are simple and they're less involved as far as the entire scope. So DLR's been able to move pretty expeditiously for this through this process. They've also begun having discussions with the AHJ, authority having jurisdiction, trying to prime the pump as far as approvals go. And we're expecting to have documents complete by the end of this month for or April, that first week of April for Blacklick Athletics. I know one of the things that, and then final pricing for this is scheduled for the end of April. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was high-level schedule overview as far as what facilities are going to be used when in a temporary basis while the high school is getting built and while this is also getting built, and then what is the permanent home?
Mhm.
I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
So when we had our board meeting, how many weeks ago was that? 4 or 5 months ago, maybe. I had shared a draft schedule at that time of how we would be accommodating the fall and spring sports when the stadium was out of commission. Nothing has actually changed with the exception of a couple updates for varsity football games. So I'll talk about those. But essentially going by sport, varsity football, JV football, and freshman football will all utilize the middle school east land and stadium. And Catherine Harris has already started having meetings with football coaches and talking about timing and travel and practice time starts and ends and who goes where when. So that's moving along nicely. As far as games are concerned, JV and freshman games will happen in the middle school east stadium, and we're looking at enhancing that area a little bit, bringing in some additional bleachers, making sure it's ready for those games. The varsity football team at this point has 5 home football games. In working with construction manager Rusili team, we pushed back the start date on the stadium project, and so we will be able to have 2 home games in the current stadium. And then the 3 remaining games, we were in talks with Otterbein. We're having some issues because of them needing to use their turf for their sports practices also, and so it kind of puts us in a time crunch for when we can start the game. So then we kind of collaborated more with Fortress Obetz, which Kara, I know you had mentioned, and I had said before, some of the other local school districts. And so what it's looking like is we will have 1 game at Otterbein, 1 game at Fortress Obetz, and 1 game at Whitehall High School. There was actually 1 date that Otterbein couldn't accommodate, and so that kind of started our conversations with Whitehall, and they've been great to work with, and very reasonable in, what the process will look like. So that's football. For soccer, both boys and girls, we do have on the schedule for them to utilize the Blacklick site. We are anticipating that being ready to go for them. However, in the event that it is not, I know Sue and Daphne, said we've got to make sure we have that backup plan. For practices, we do have enough field space over at Middle School West in between the stadium and the softball diamond. We've done that measurement, made sure that's available. And then as far as game times, that gets a little trickier because, typically when boys are home, girls are away. And so that's the case with other high schools around the area. So we have been in talks with Fortress Obets to be able to support, should it be needed on our game nights, as well as working with Whitehall and New Albany, just to kind of see what we can work out. And it might require, as a backup plan, a little bit of juggling for game nights and times and things like that. But that's all continuing to be worked out. It's going to be ready. Blacklick Athletic Complex is going to be ready. Cross country did not need alternate facilities. They use Gahanna around town. Girls tennis in the fall. Again, hoping that the tennis courts out at the Blacklick site are ready. However, in the event that they're not, we are able to continue utilizing 8 of our courts on the high school property, and Russilli will take 2 of our courts for some of their lay down zones and things like that. And in working with the tennis coaches, that works. We actually only use 8 of them now because 2 of them are kind of in bad shape. And so that works out for tennis as well. And then lastly, the band, typically having 1 evening a week that they go out and practice in the stadium. We have a space for them over at Middle School West, should they want to use that. But the band directors are still kind of processing if that's something that they want to utilize, or if they want to just go ahead and use the parking lot space we've identified for their 5th period practice time. And we have a meeting coming up, I think it's tomorrow, just to touch base with them again about the space that's available and accessing that site as well. And then spring, we should 100% be good to go with everyone, needing to access the Blacklick Athletic. So.
And Jill, just to be clear, students will be bused.
Yes, we will have transportation available. As we shared earlier, we do have several sports teams that already practice out there, and many athletes do, drive themselves or make their own arrangements, but we will have transportation available for all the athletes.
Jill, for tennis, you're anticipating the courts will be ready end of July, or do you have any ballpark?
I don't know exactly.
I thought we talked about tennis wasn't going to be because we had them in the fall here for the girls.
Yeah, we definitely have the courts available.
Yeah.
I just wasn't sure it was confirmed that they wouldn't be ready.
Yeah, Russilli, it's going to be close on the tennis courts, and like Russilli is confident they can get that base asphalt layer down, but it has to cure for like 28 days or 35 days or something like that before you can put your sport coat on, and that's what they're most anxious about.
Because you can't predict the weather.
Because you can't predict the weather. But they also only need 2 or 4 of the 10 tennis courts that you have, which would leave 6 tennis courts on the existing site available for this fall.
So you're hoping, you're optimistic.
It's actually 8.
So there'll be eight tennis
We'll have
courts
8.
available.
Yeah.
So you're
Okay, I'm sorry.
you're optimistic by August, but like the beginning of August, maybe.
Yeah,
but
that would be the
plan
optimistic
B.
approach. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The real driver is we have to have soccer
Yes.
done. So if we have a backup plan for tennis,
That's
the
not the
thought
priority on the site.
put as much of the
Effort.
focus and effort for soccer to be
Mhm.
ready
Mhm.
out there and know that we have backup.
So as they're prepping the land, it'll be the 3 athletic fields in tennis first. Working on those, the tennis, the curing time is the real issue with tennis. That's what's probably gonna drive us a little bit later, but getting those fields ready to go. And then they'll move over to the other side and start working on the softball fields and the indoor batting cages. So
Yeah.
Scott, was there a house where the tennis courts are going?
there was.
And so all of that got removed.
Yep.
And so we're not going to run into the same stabilization issue.
And it wasn't just buried either.
No. No, we didn't knock down the house. We did not. Do that. It was all removed.
Okay,
We came back in with solid soil.
okay.
We did some test holes out there and we're not seeing that type of, soil. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that we don't see it.
Yeah.
And we're not putting a
Big building.
3-story
on it.
school
Right,
on
we're good.
top of
Right,
it. Or
yeah, we don't have to
it's
wait.
a little bit different.
Issues, right?
This is gonna be amazing.
Oh, I think, yeah, this is gonna be a fantastic facility. And I think that synthetic turf there'll be no remorse at all with respect to putting that in.
I just come back to, if we don't fence it.
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, well, that's,
Absolutely at risk.
yeah. So the last 2 bullet points that I wanted to just share with you all is our current budget right now is $5.75 million. It will not provide for synthetic turf. If the synthetic turf gets the green light, the projected budget would be $6.56 million. But that's not just, it doesn't just get you the synthetic turf, it gets you some supplemental fencing,
Thank you.
it gets you some supplemental hardscape, as well as bleachers that can make that particular field much more versatile and a true long-lasting amenity for the district.
Okay.
So where's the extra money come from? I don't get it.
Yeah, good question. So I kind of mapped out some of the potential financing options for Sue and Daphne and a few others. One of the things that we've been able to realize since we met last time is that some of our costs, even though I kind of shared the high school or the elementary school overruns, we've also seen some savings in some other areas that that could be potentially reinvested in this particular scope element amongst a few others.
Really? That's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
That fully covered that?
That's a lot of money.
Well, I don't know if
To
it fully
like
covers it, because we still have a contingency draw.
Yeah.
We would still have a contingency draw.
It's out of the 158 million for the high school, so something has to be adjusted within that bucket.
Right, right. So we're
It's,
gonna,
it's not out of there yet, because we have the contingency, right? So basically what Mark's saying is, as we find savings, we put that money into the contingency and we draw on that as other projects are going over, but they're looking at that diligently all the time. But
yeah.
at some point, our
When-
biggest concern
when
was that on these smallest projects we're over,
Right,
and we haven't even gotten to the big
Right.
projects. So we had a lot of discussion about that piece of it. And this, everybody at the table agreed, if we get to that point, we'll have no option but to
Okay.
make big cuts
right.
At the high school.
at the high school level, because, that's the last project, right? So
When do we have to decide about the turf and all that?
decide now.
Yeah.
Right now?
No.
Well,
No,
not
no,
today.
no,
Not
soon.
today. Yeah.
Sorry.
It is
I'm just
an
trying
imminent decision in order to not have to go through the backup plan that Jill had mentioned.
Right.
Because this takes time to construct and everything else, but to Sue's point, the money has to come from somewhere. So
Right,
you
right.
either release savings in other areas to offset this potential budget adjustment, or you make other adjustments to create.
So
reinvestment
you're saying as we go along, it'll just become apparent if we're gonna be able to swing it or not? For the-
No, I think you would
You're
make
planning
it-
on it?
you would make a decision and we would manage to that budget, not just this budget, but also however it was financed
Okay.
would also need to be
There are always
managed as well.
interlocking pieces,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So, but it's finite, what we have to spend.
Yep,
So
yep.
if we can get some here and take it here, but ultimately we have a cap.
Right.
And so we have a $5 million contingency, I think with the elementaries and the
where are
middles were.
Because I couldn't do that math that quickly. Where are we at with the overruns at the middle and the elementary? Where are
do
we
you have
right now
that?
toward the
It's
contingency?
not, we haven't burned much of it because
Okay.
of the savings. We originally had, at
Yeah.
least from this spreadsheet that you just showed me.
Right.
At some point, we were bouncing around
Right.
one or
It
one
looks
or
like
2
2 million,
million.
right?
Right,
And
with
then-
that.
And then when we did value engineering and put it back in, it raised it back up.
Okay.
But I think one of the scary things is we had this discussion with Mark, and what we extrapolated, if both elementaries were 5% over and you extrapolate that to the other
Right.
projects,
Yes.
you're thinking, wow,
Right,
we could
which
be
is our huge.
really in trouble.
Yeah,
And so what Mark reassured us, I don't think it was exactly a guarantee, but it was a reassurance that we,
You know,
we are gonna have much more time. Remember, the elementaries, we kind of rushed to get the academic wings ready because we didn't have time with the supply chain issues for structural steel. So we had a different approach, cement roofs instead of steel roofs. And so because we did that, what ended up happening is we didn't have the ability to price and make reductions based on pricing as we went along. We're gonna have plenty of time to do, well, you never have plenty of time, but you're gonna have time.
More time than.
More time in both these projects to be able to kind of, like 50% DD will be really important. right?
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
And so,
So to build off Dion's question on the budget aspect, when we get to that point on the decision on the field, will we be able to, I know we can't predict 100%, but would you be able to call out, Mark, like, here are some danger zones where we are not sure, where like
Yeah,
where we were
areas of
concerned.
vulnerability.
Yes, areas of
Yes,
vulnerability.
yeah. Well, we can certainly comment on our highest risks and our lowest risks and how do we best mitigate that. Going back to the elementary school, one of the biggest risks was getting out of the ground, right? The soil conditions, even though you're doing borings and things like that, that can mitigate some of that risk, but it's really only as good as that one data point. And I think what we've learned through this process is that we need to get a lot more data related to the site conditions in front of our design team so that we can understand their impact on earthwork, understand the soil conditions impact on foundation design, so that if there are cost overruns, we're anticipating those through design rather than through putting a shovel in the ground.
Right.
So we should be able to mitigate a lot more risk on the upcoming projects than we were able to on the elementary school. That's why I cautioned everyone to not be inclined to take a direct linear correlation. We spent this much on the elementary school, so it's going to be the same percentage on every other building. And it's just not the case.
The only
I
thing
can't
that
guarantee that, no guarantees, no
Well,
guarantees.
but the other part of it is, we do have all the call outs of what price increases and different things like that could be.
Yeah.
Which we've talked about over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So to me, that is still the biggest risk, but to go back to the earlier, we're at 1.9 million of the contingency
Mhm.
that's been. So, I mean, there's still concerns out there, so we have to have a very diligent process and stay on top of it, which I know they are.
That,
Of going through all of it and having the right conversations at the right time so that we can stay ahead of it.
Yeah.
So,
the 1.9 million contingency does take into consideration the project budget being subsidized to provide for the turf.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah,
That's good.
so after the savings is reinvested
okay.
into this project to provide for the
Additional
turf,
costs.
there's a $1.9 million contingency burn.
Okay.
so it's like 1.4 without that.
Yeah, a little more than that. I think because of the fencing and bleachers and hardscape and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
Did you want to say something?
I did, yeah. To your point, I'm looking at this and thinking, based on what we're looking at in the news with the economy, shortages and whatnot, I know we're gonna have more time, to decide on these things with the high school. But does anybody really think it's going to be getting better in the next 2 years? Because it sure doesn't look like it. And if we're having these kind of cost overruns on the middle schools, like you said, it makes me think that it's going to be substantially better than something as large as the high school. And so now we're talking about just cutting money out of the high school, when really we should be planning for it to be more expensive at the high school.
Well, all budgets are finite. So relative to how the economy is reacting, you're absolutely right. I do not expect things to get better. And we certainly will not see things getting cheaper. They may stabilize or level off. But with these interim price checks that I was mentioning earlier, like the 50% DD on the high school, the 100% DD on the high school, we're going to anticipate what that cost escalation value is going to be at each one of those cost report outs. And earlier, like last year, our escalation factor might have been 6%, let's say. Now our escalation factor is more along the lines of like 9%, right? So we price things in today's dollars, and then we anticipate that things are going to change along the lines of 9%, but everything's tying out to $158 million. Okay.
For the high school.
For the high school, yeah, but and for the middle schools as well, and same for this.
And we also get a guaranteed maximum price.
Yes.
Do you think that should be explained?
Yeah. So sure. So Russilli will, before work commences, Russilli needs to provide a guaranteed maximum price, which means that based on a set of scope documents, they're saying if nothing changes in the scope, we will guarantee that your spend will not be higher than this value.
Or if something changes in the scope.
If something changes in the scope, it depends on why it changed. If the district says, I want to do this instead of that, the district needs to find a way to pay for that. If not the Russilli would screw something up, but there is a small contingency inside the GMP that provides for several things that are inferred in the documents that Russilli should be providing for, but they may not have implicitly defined it in their GMP.
So there's not really a guaranteed maximum amount.
It is a guarantee. It's a guaranteed maximum amount, and they're also guaranteeing the schedule. However, if the district makes a change, then they would be getting a change order to their GMP.
Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't it part of why we went over was because we requested changes to be more staff friendly and user friendly for the students at the middle schools?
At middle school.
And
west.
so that's
Yeah.
why we went a little over, it was our thing, it wasn't them.
Well, that is true, but Russilli has not yet provided a guaranteed maximum price. So it's really more of a budget adjustment than a change order to the GMP. Okay. And that's what this would be too, if we were to put turf down.
So last question is, what's the most you have to cut out of the high school budget?
Well, I'm not planning on cutting anything out of the high school budget right now. So, and if you recall in the high school dashboard, our current budget still is at 158. And that when we did our SD price check, it tied out to $158 million. Now, as the scope develops, as it evolves, and market conditions change, the dollar may not go as far as it did at SD, but it doesn't mean that we raise the budget. That's where the discipline comes in on behalf of the district and the entire team. We gotta pull it back because that 158 needs to hold true unless the district decides to make a change for one reason or another.
And our contingency is 5 million. And so like, as we found things in the elementary and middle, there may be things in the high school as well. Like one of the items was 2 TV monitors, right? And we dropped it to 1. Is that?
No,
one of our
no,
savings?
that's a potential one.
Oh, that's on the table still?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, still on the table.
But those things like that, right? Like, those are the kinds of things that are being debated and
Cost-saving ideas.
cost-saving ideas that are still being on the table as possible mitigants
Yeah.
for the
I
other
guess
costs.
I misunderstood, and I thought he was saying that the overages coming from the middle school and elementary schools are being taken out.
Yeah.
No.
No.
Oh, no,
No,
I'm
no,
sorry.
I'm
We have a
sorry, yeah.
contingency, yeah. We have a total project contingency of 5 million.
Right. That's why I was
So-
wondering where we were in that contingency.
So, yeah,
But if we had huge overruns, we would have to cut someplace to stay at the 158.
Yeah.
So we didn't want people thinking that we're gonna be coming back for more money. We're gonna be staying within the 158.
Yeah, exactly,
Correct.
exactly.
And not cutting the amount of money we're putting toward the high school, but changing what it is we're getting for that money. So for instance, we
Yeah.
might go with a cheaper chair than, originally. That's just an example.
Or one TV instead of two
Two
TVs.
TVs.
Exactly.
At this point, right, right.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were over budget at Lincoln Elementary by about 3 or 4 million, the furniture budget was way high from the architect's standpoint, and so it was like over 2 million. We pulled that back, and we had done all this furniture in the district and other buildings, and so our team did that, and we saved about 1.3 million. And so our tech team is going to be poised to do the tech of the building, and so that should save money. So there will be ways, I mean, that's not guaranteed. I mean, it may not work out the way it worked out at Lincoln, but it was certainly, very helpful to do the things that we could do in the ways that we wanted to do them and save quite a bit. We'll continue to kind of look at that.
and I hate to cut this off, but we have the ESSER presentation. So if we can move on to that
We
next
did one
item.
of the-
Oh, I'm sorry.
So-
Just real quick, so backtracking to the elementary, you sort of touched on that, and then I do have a question about athletics, and I promise to be quick. So for High Point, I know because of the delay of everything being done, the influx, like shifting of students is gonna be one extra year. Does that mean the hiring of an assistant principal will also be one extra year, or
No, we are planning to move forward with
Okay.
the assistant principal.
And then, as far as the athletics, so at East, you said the bleachers because of the football. So I currently have 2 kids at East, but one that's doing track. And at the parent meeting last week, we were told for our home meets, the bleachers are off limits. And I went, they're pretty bad. So then when you're saying we need to put more bleachers in, my question is, what does that timeline look like? Because you're talking about obviously the fall football games, but that's also when the construction on East will start for the building too, right?
And we're working on an answer to that issue with the current bleacher.
Yeah.
And then, because none of that construction will come up that close
Okay.
to the field and to the track. So we're looking at other places that we can securely put bleachers to add to it. But the bleacher that you're talking about is, there's an issue, there's major
Right.
issues. So that's why it's quarter, we have it blocked off so nobody can use it,
So are we looking at putting bleachers on the opposite side of the field? Because
Not
that
at
ground-
this
Okay.
time. So,
Yeah, do you want to describe what the problem is? It's erosion.
Oh, yeah,
you know?
totally.
yeah, so when they put it in, they put
They
half
didn't
of it.
stabilize the
No, they
toilet.
didn't.
Well, what they did was they put half of it
It's on a hill.
on concrete,
Right.
and then they put supports behind it
Right.
that have, and when the water rolls, I actually have a video of the water just rolling right through there, and it's eroding that soil. So the pillars, the pylons, piles. So they have the dirt around them that was holding it in place is eroded away. So that's why we blocked them off, because we didn't want anybody to get hurt.
Right.
So we've been working with an architect and an engineer to figure out, can we restabilize these and make them safe? If not, then we need to move them and then go in and create, like a retaining wall so that it would be safe and we don't have that water eroding that. So that's what we're working through right now.
But more than likely, that won't be solved until they need to be solved for the fall, like.
We're gonna solve it as quickly as the engineer tells us we can safely do something
Okay.
to make them secure.
But then you're looking at adding more. I mean, there's no way the amount of bleachers that are there would be, you know, good enough or enough for football games. I mean, were you looking at adding more?
Yeah, we-
further down?
It's freshman
towards-
gate.
Yeah, we will,
Oh, okay.
we will
Yeah.
add more
Okay,
going farther down,
okay.
so. yeah,
Like
that's where
towards
we're at.
Reba,
Yes.
okay.
Okay, so next on our agenda is the ESSER update, and Jill Elliott will.
We had a meaty agenda today.
We did. I'm sorry, everyone.
Okay, so looking forward to giving an update on the grant relief funds that we've been provided from the federal government in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Wanted to start by saying at next week's Student Learning and Achievement Committee meeting, we're also going to be touching more specifically on some of the tools and resources we've put in place using ESSER funds. So I'm not going to go into detail about specifics of the allocations, but tonight's meeting will just kind of give an overview. Hi, Mark. An overview of the funds, the amount we've been allocated, how long we have to spend them, and then kind of show you the spreadsheet and the breakdown of how that's been planned out. So this slide just gives an overview of the pandemic relief funds. And so we have the Sr1 Fund, also known as the CARES Act. And really ESSER we refer to them as ESSER funds. Within the office, sometimes we get more specific, but Sr1 is CARES Act, and we were originally granted $983,718 and some change. Then and I will go in specifically to talk about the purposes of each of these funds. The next one was the Sr2 Fund, and that's the CRRSA Act. And in this one, we got a larger sum, which was $4.1 million. And then came the Sr3 Funds, or as a part of the ARP Act. And then the ARP Act funds have kind of different branches. And so overall, the American Rescue Plan gave us almost $9.4 million. And then in addition, from those ARP funds, we had almost $37,000 to allocate to supporting our homeless families, as well as an additional, just under $500,000 for ARP IDEA Part B funds to support students with disabilities. And so those are kind of the different funds that we have been working with over the last few years. And I'll make sure you all have these slides as well. For
Thank
sure.
you.
That would be great. Yeah. So you guys are like writing so fast. So this timeline kind of shows our fund availability, and when we have them, they're kind of broken up into quarters, and when we need to expend the accounts by. And so Sr1, we had that available through September 30th of 2022. So those funds are pretty much expended. I did talk with Michelle. She's going to do like a few account corrections and things like that, but then those funds will be, fully expended. Sr2 we have through September 30th of 2023 to use. Sr3 extends another year through September 30th of 2024. And then the ARP homeless funds also go through 2024, but the IDEA-B ends at 2023. So one note I want to make is that, from time to time, we do get changes in the amount that has been allocated to us. So the amounts we have incorporated that I'm sharing tonight are not the original amounts that we actually got additional funds. And sometimes they also will change deadlines and things like that. So this is where we are at this point. Yes. This slide kind of outlines the purpose of each of those funds. So the initial funds came when we were preparing to implement our distance learning, right after the initial shutdown in March, and then preparing for the 2021 school year. And so you see that these funds were specifically for preventing, preparing for, and responding to COVID-19. The Sr2 funds also allow us to spend money on the purposes from Sr1 and added additional focus on addressing learning loss, preparing for the reopening of schools, and then things related to improving air quality within our schools. And then we were given the larger ARP funds, and this also encompasses all of the purposes from 1 and 2, but also adds in a concerted focus on interventions related to summer programming, enrichment, extended day after school tutoring, things like that. There is a provision here that requires us to set aside at least 20% of that almost 4 million that's allocated specifically for evidence-based interventions such as, and they kind of give those examples. Again, all of these funds can be used, for the same purposes, but there are very specific allowances, and I'm going to get into specifically those things, but they do include us being able to hire additional staff, and for continuity of services to avoid things like layoffs and such. So, overall, our goals for utilizing this pandemic support were to make sure that we could safely reopen schools for all students, that we could assess and then address those academic learning and the social emotional skill loss that we know our students, had throughout the pandemic, and then to build staff capacity and infrastructure that will help close, opportunity, resource, and digital divides that our students have to ensure equitable outcomes for students. And those are requirements of these funds to make sure we're targeting subgroups and making sure all students have access to our resources. So I have a few slides that just kind of highlight some of the things that each of these funds were allocated toward. But like I said, I'm going to shift to a spreadsheet and kind of show you the full scope of things. So as we prepared for the distance learning year, the Sr1 CARES Act funds went to things like our digital platforms and tools that we use. We enhanced our Google Suite platform. We utilized it to pay staff for some summer task force work.
Can you clarify what task force you're talking about?
Yes, I will do that. Thank you. So as we led into the 2021 school year, we had a task force of GJPS staff that we pulled together to get feedback about what our instructional programming and efforts needed to look like in this remote learning setting. And so, talking about plans and protocols and the different types of technology tools we needed to have accessible for our students now that they weren't here in person. How are we going to make sure we're ensuring educational access from home? So it's separate from our COVID task force. This was a specific staff task force related to instructional programming. Also PPE, we purchased air purifiers that year. We of course implemented stipends for contact tracing, which has been a lot of work over the last couple of years. And then things like making sure we had enough food refrigeration trucks for all the grab and go meals. So this is just a snapshot of some of the things that we spent the CARES Act funding on. So with the Sr2 and 3 funds, which again were those larger sums, it included an engagement and planning piece. And so these funds, again, were really to address the learning loss and make sure that we were able to open safely and ensure that we have interventions in place all throughout the year, not just in the school year, but also throughout the summer and after school. So this, these links, I actually have them already pulled up. We engaged the community and staff with using a survey. And so this is the survey that went out. It was in June of 2020. And then this is the actual spreadsheet that kind of shows all of the feedback that came in from that survey. And so, just kind of scrolling through, you can see there was some, what should be the district's top priorities and what are the areas that you think that we really need to spend, time and money on supporting students with. And I'll just show this summary slide. I don't know.
Who did that survey go to?
It went district-wide to all of our district-wide families and staff in June of 2020.
Really? I have no memory of anything.
Okay.
I don't either. She asked me if I got that email. I don't remember.
Yeah. We didn't have a ton of responses. It was in the summertime, but we had 113 people respond. And so it did go district-wide.
Any idea what the subject of the email might have been?
Probably American Rescue Sr2 Fund survey, something to that effect. I could pull it up and I could pull it up for you.
It would be helpful to know because I had no recollection of it. So in questions that I've had from other people very specific to this point, I haven't been able to reference anything.
Okay.
I literally had.
Okay. Okay, yeah, and I knew Judy sent it out for us, so I can get with her on, how it went out.
That would be helpful.
So this essentially just is a summary of the data that was gathered, and taking a look at the priorities, and the blue highlights are kind of the top 5 vote getters essentially. So you can see, starting at the highest, instructional materials and resources to meet the needs of students, followed by social emotional counseling and wellness support, updates to improved and safe learning environments, securing assessment tools to make sure we can pinpoint and target student needs. And then the 5th one was technology updates and improving connectivity. And then drilling down a little more specifically for need, it was reading, math, writing, social emotional support, and then motivation and engagement support, because that was the time when a lot of our kiddos had been out of school for so long. And so that was, an area that came in as well. From here, we had meetings where we pulled together our district administrators. Again, this data came in the summer, and we took a look at, I have lots of different tabs over here, sorry. So we took a look at some of the different support roles that we might be interested in putting in place. And so this spreadsheet just kind of outlines how we in groups kind of mapped out who's the target audience, what does that support and resource look like. And then as an administrative team, we also did some ranking, like prioritizing based on our students.
MTSS.
Multi-tiered systems of support. It's the old RTI, response to intervention. The school acronyms change all the time. But it's essentially the process that we use across the district when we identify students that are struggling, and we try to pinpoint and put interventions in place. And do data checks, and ultimately we're trying to stop that referral to the special education service. So that's what MTSS is. So then this is kind of a priority summary of the different groups that worked through some of the different support roles that ultimately led some of our decisions related to how we were going to be allocating the funds. Okay.
Is this on GJPS?
I'm sorry?
Is this on the website?
This slideshow?
Yeah.
Yeah, this whole video will be available. And so in addition to the community feedback, we collected, again, the administrative input and planning. And then that led us to making sure that we were aligning some of these targets with the allowable expenditures. And so the next 3 slides are kind of all the different ways we have to tie this funding into what we're doing. It's one of the, it's when you get money from the federal government or the state government, it's great, but there are a lot of parameters and, hoops to jump through. And so we're constantly, even today, we're having discussions about, well, could this align, does this, relate? And so we're always working within these allowable expenditure kind of line items. So you can see A through O are the different things that we have to fit our expenditures within. So these are some of the things that Sr2 went toward. And I will say, as I pull up the spreadsheet, you'll see that some of these things were implemented in 2021 and then continued in 21, 22, and 22, 23 until the money essentially runs out. But again, expanding the Google Suite Enterprise, bringing in the school's PLP programming and support. We had Chromebook replacements and repairs. We utilized the funds for our universal screener. That was one of the things that came out as a priority from the community feedback as well, making sure we're pinpointing, where those deficits are. Implementing after-school tutoring with transportation. We haven't typically had transportation available for after-school tutoring, so that was something these funds allowed us to do to, make sure that it was accessible to more students. purchased MERV filters and bipolar ionization, which Scott would have to speak to, and then additional PPE. And then,
I missed the summer school.
I'm so sorry.
Are we,
Oh, free summer school and experiential learning.
did we have increased numbers last summer for summer school? Because it was still remote, right?
It was less, I think it was a little bit less.
Virtual, yeah, it was a little bit less. But we are intending this summer to also do free summer school as well.
Okay,
And
good.
in person, and so hoping
And
that will
hopefully
increase.
raising the
Yep.
numbers?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like a perfect use of these funds,
Yeah.
right?
I think
Closing the
the
gap.
other piece, and just in full transparency, is, you know, our staff and our families are exhausted, right?
Yeah.
From just living in the COVID world. And so it's not only challenging to sometimes find staff to work summer school,
Yeah.
but also, you know, families, I think at to some extent, we're just like, we just need a break from GJBS or from school in general, right? And so,
And nobody was rushing to do online so much.
Right.
Exactly,
Oh,
right,
no.
I wouldn't either. Right.
But the idea would be that this summer would be in
in
person.
person, yep, yeah.
And can you offer some like fun things to
Mhm.
inspire?
And we did do that last year. We had Jump Bunch and we
Right.
had coast-side programming. And this
Okay.
year, we have hopes to kind of try and develop some of the trip property. And we're working
Yeah.
with the city foundation, the Parks and Rec Foundation, on maybe some outdoor, you know, learning
Oh,
opportunities.
good.
So yeah, we are trying to make it fun and more appealing. So Sr3 Funds, you know, we hired a lot of supplemental support. So over 30 positions, 35 positions. And so
Temporary.
temporary is where I was headed next, is, and that's really, really tricky. We've probably, if we've said it once, we've said it a dozen times to our administrative team, right? Because once you get used to having a support, it's tough to lose it. But these are temporary funds for a very specific purpose. Now, there may be some roles that we end up working into the 5-year forecast because we've seen them, you know, they're beneficial, or they're all beneficial, but it is important to note that these are temporary support positions. So we've got reading and math supports, we have mental health liaisons, we brought in additional campus supervisors, and I didn't list it here, but a dean at the high school, continuing the universal screener and some of the online instructional tools. Kind of one of the enhancement or enrichment pieces that Matt Blackwell is wanting to do is bring in some additional esports equipment to help with that motivation and excitement for kids. We also recently brought, we've been contracting with an agency, but we just actually, I think it's on the board agenda, it's a board agenda item for Thursday, to hire a board certified behavior analyst to support in our buildings with some of our more extreme situations where students are struggling with, you know, choices and programming and such. And then the Goshen Lane Window Project, actually, we kept that in the ESSER allocations.
And then NPI.
It was, we moved it. We moved it into ESSER. So I did put a slide in here related to allowable ESSER funds for facilities, renovations, and improvements. But because I know there had been some previous discussion about, you know, can we use these funds for some of our facilities work? And so we had talked about moving a larger amount of PI projects over into these this budget, but ultimately ended up taking it back out because of the parameters that were set for us. And, you know, some of the questions that the auditor, you know, has been asking and things like that. So in order for us to use the ESSER funds for these types of things, they need to be specific to enabling operations of school to reduce the virus transmission. So related to health needs and health hazards, and then inspection, testing, and replacement to upgrade projects. And you can see down there at the very bottom, it specifically says window and door replacement projects. So we thought, let's keep that one in there for sure. Okay, so I'm going to pause and I'm going to go to the spreadsheet. I do have a couple slides there at the end to show how we are utilizing the homeless and the IDAB funds. But this is essentially what the spreadsheet looks like, and we have it broken up by ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3. And then specifically, you can see we have those allowable activities, we have to connect them to specific, allowable expenditures. So we also have tabs for that. And so, I mentioned before some of the online tools that we utilized for the distance learning. And so you can see, those listed here with the purchase amount. Kind of goes over. So this is our total amount. And you can see, once all of these expenditures come out, we balance out at the, there we go. So Sr1 specifically, I will say you don't see these numbers matching up. And that's related to the comment I made earlier about Michelle needing to make a few account corrections. So it will all balance out in the end. The allocations for Sr2 and 3 though are exact matches. I know we like to see those. So Sr2 and 3, we have them broken down by, you can see year over here on the side. And then again, we've got the department, the allowable activity, and then specifically the item. And then as we scroll over, you can kind of see the actual, funding associated with some of those pieces. And so some of the things that I highlighted on the slides, again, will make this accessible to you all. But you can see, this one in particular, we allocated some funds because we weren't able to bring revenues in to support with some of our middle school athletic replenishment of uniforms and equipment and things like that. So we were able to allocate some funds here. We have some of our intervention tools. This is library replacements because we sent a lot of books home in distance learning that maybe didn't come back. So we needed to be able to replace those for our schools. Our assessment tools, our Dreambox and Lexi are our math and literacy programs that students utilize to support their skills. And just it goes on and on and on and on, which again, we'll touch base at the SLA meeting next week, more specifically about some of those things. As we've, and I'll show you it balanced out here. Match there.
4181401.
Okay, as we move over to Sr3, which is primarily the fund where we are taking some of those additional staff hires. That's where all of those come from. And I do have like a separate spreadsheet that outlines who are all the people in those roles. But essentially you can see for 21-22, a lot of these are kind of repeats from year to year. So we've got some additional teachers, the aides for math, the support for reading, the liaisons, the campus supervisors, and it kind of continues on. Allocation for some additional building support in the future that we might, as we continue going through the year, like the BCBA was a recent decision to kind of allocate funds towards. So the board certified behavior analyst. Sorry, BCBA, another acronym.
Still frustrated over RTI.
Yeah. And so, over the years, and you can see the cost breakdowns for each of the, this is the way the budget has to go into the state. But ultimately,
have we had any classroom hirings to reduce class sizes? This, especially where there's high special ed numbers, maybe that.
So we do have 4 teaching positions that were added last year. You can see, I think it was 2 at Chapel Field, 1 at High Point, and 1 at the high school, which allowed us to lower some class sizes. And that was something that we worked with the previous treasurer on, taking that out of ESSER funds. That's something that will be worked in then, or that already is worked into the 5-year forecast once these funds are gone. As far as class size reduction, we monitor, and I have a different spreadsheet somewhere.
I'm sure you
pull up. We monitor the building enrollment and the number of sections, and we,
So we haven't seen that for a while.
We haven't.
The board. We used to get them monthly.
Oh, really? Well, this is what it looks like right now.
It would be great if we could get them. I don't know when. I
think Pam Schilling used to run those monthly numbers for you.
So it used to be in our board folder.
Okay.
Ahead of board meetings. I don't know when it stopped. I didn't realize it until yesterday.
Well, it stopped when we went virtual.
Maybe that's probably right. Yeah, it would be great.
I went back all
to
of
be able to
last
see
year.
that again.
Okay. So this is how we track that though. This is a live document. Every Friday, the principals are updating it. And you can see, for instance, Chapel Field, currently has 3 sections of first grade. If we kept it at 3 sections, they would have 29 in the class, which obviously we wouldn't do. But if you scroll down here, they have 4 sections in second grade, which would put their numbers at. So you can see if I change this to 3 and a teacher goes from second grade to first grade,
Right.
then we're up around 22, which is, you know, an ideal place to be. So this is how we kind of track that in an ongoing basis.
So you already have for Sr3 an allocation of how you're wanting to spend all the money.
Mhm.
That's how everything agrees.
Yes.
So we'll talk more in the student learning and achievement meeting next week based on like the MAPS process and I think the identification of where there might be some changes in how you have things planned for next year based on some of those results. Because what my concern is like Goshen, Royal Manor, where it could be the learning disparity might be even greater.
Sure. Yep.
That the class sizes or intervention people or additional support staff needs to be greater than maybe some of the other schools, and that process is really going to be what supports that, right?
Right. And we do have, I know you know this, but we also have additional grant funds for our title buildings where we put additional staff in place as well. And so we do utilize that support. But we also take a look at how we allocate our resources. And that's something that we are having conversations about, you know, currently, and this is just like a very high level conversation, but currently we have a pretty standard way that we allocate reading teachers across the district. But the reality is that in one building, students, I'll just use an example, in one building, students reading at a level C in kindergarten are able to get support, where we have in another building, students reading at a B that can't get support because they don't have additional. So we are having conversations right now about how to right size that allocation to make sure we're responding to some of that data. Yeah.
Are you looking at languages primary language in the student numbers too? I mean,
like our EL population, of course, we have EL services now in all of our elementary buildings, with the exception of High Point because the numbers are lower. And, you know, we have additional staff and alternative instructors allocated to support students in that way. Is that what you?
I know, and we're divulging what
digressing
we
a
should
little
be
bit.
doing next week, right? So we'll keep it monetarily focused here.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. So again, this is kind of the breakdown. You can see some of the things that I pulled out to highlight on those slides are worked in here and kind of how those costs are worked in. There are some, you know, cost estimates. For instance, you know, we currently hired a BCBA at this particular number. And so we are trying to carry it over the years, but she might leave and that cost might change. Right. So we might have to make adjustments along the way for sure. I go back to the slides. Just to touch on, and I will say in this spreadsheet, I do have the homeless breakdown as well, but the IDAB funds are in a different spreadsheet. So just in place.
How many homeless do we have now?
Get you that number.
More than 10?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the homeless funds were, you know, we had some very targeted discussions and we reached out to the families to say what would be the most helpful for you. So those funds are allocated to provide transportation to activities beyond the typical school day, you know, to provide supplemental books to, you know, we had a student that wanted to participate in a swim team but couldn't afford a bathing suit. And so we were able to get some supplies to allow them to participate in those particular activities. So these are some of the ways that we've been able to support our homeless families. And then the IDAB funds have been allocated for additional school psychologists, occupational therapy, case management, a district social worker specifically to work with our families of students with disabilities and helping them to navigate all the resources that are out there. You know, making sure we could bring in a preschool specific building sub. That wasn't something that we had in place before. Now our sub situation is so much better now. We have been at 100% several times and in the high 90s. That's our trend right now. So that's excellent. But that was one of the ways we allocated those funds, as well as the preschool's done some family training events for their families.
I have.
Good
And many
news.
more spreadsheets.
It would be great to, yeah, when you share.
Yeah. Awesome.
It's a lot
It's a lot.
to keep track of. But what an opportunity that these dollars have given us to
Right.
supplement. I mean, there are some students that just could not engage virtually, right? So having to catch them up when they're back in the building.
Mhm. And we've always had a wide continuum of, where students are on the learning continuum essentially, but it's really widened, right?
Yes.
Because some students were able to be successful in the virtual environment or in the hybrid setting, whereas others that just kind of, it compounded the difficulties that they already had. And so definitely having additional staff to help support, which, we have conversations about, we have to be really judicious about just adding additional staff, because when you add additional staff and they leave class, then they're leaving the quality instruction with their highly trained teacher as well. So it's always a balancing act, as to where those supports, come in and what the right plan is for each kid.
Well, the good news is we still have 2 more years of utilizing the funds,
absolutely.
which
Right.
is the great news, right?
Yeah.
Catch them up by then.
Right.
Is it possible that the spreadsheets that you showed could be posted online, like ESER 1, here's exactly what we spent dollar wise, ESER 2, here's exactly what we spent, here's our plan for ESER 3. I mean, it's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is.
And I know even, and this is my second question, I guess, I know like the boosters weren't able to have their tag day virtual, but I found out that they haven't been able to have tag day for the last 2 years because of COVID.
Actually, it was,
Can any of that,
this
extra
was
money
weather
be used
related.
for
It was supposed to be Saturday, Angela.
well, the last 2 years they couldn't move.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, I
think they
didn't
did it
know, I
virtually.
didn't realize, I mean,
They didn't virtually.
So are
Last
they
year's.
usually, are they as effective virtually? I
The
mean, I haven't kept up on that.
The band has been,
Right, the band, they
But
come to my,
athletic-
they come to my
Oh, yeah,
door.
but athletic-
Which is fine.
right?
I mean, I think a lot of families have also been impacted by COVID, so they can't just give like they have been giving. And I'm just asking if there's any way for some of the boosters and PTOs and PTA that like a lot of people have been impacted. Is there a way for some of that money to go back into those?
I don't think the government would let us give it to a booster group.
So Scott.
I was gonna say,
Scott,
yeah,
go ahead.
and that's the unfortunate part, because it has to go to district programs, and those are support programs, but they're not
Managed by the
separate
district.
legal entities, unfortunately. Because they're separate legal entities, we can't divert funds to them to pay for that, but as Jill mentioned, and I think in ESER 2, we could do that for middle school athletic programs because they lost revenue, because that was a district program.
Right.
Boosters is not, and that's where that,
But
That's
is
where
it
that line
possible to
gets
pick
drawn.
up expenses that boosters would have paid?
Right. Exactly,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, I
Because
think
I
that's what
found
you're
out, I
getting
didn't
to, right?
know that like Lincoln Live had to raise money for, I mean, I don't say had to, but they raised money for
They chose to.
cameras. And I'm hearing that theater raises money for costumes and all these things that could the
Yeah.
district say, we're gonna cover those things and not.
Yeah.
I think the opportunity is, because I know when I was on all of the booster boards for like vocal and performing arts, there's a lot of misunderstanding. So Scott, being new treasurer, I think there needs to be a framework for everybody to understand what the school can pay for and what boosters can pay for. And I would tell you across all programs, they all have different ways of doing it. And then there starts being all of this, well, why are we paying for this if you got paid for that? So I think now is a perfect opportunity to kind of put some framework around it so that we can get some parity back to some of the different clubs and just a general understanding of what the process is, or like Lincoln Live sending out, fundraisers. I mean, all the different groups doing that. There needs to be a better process for how that's being done.
and I think
And a lot of
and this gentleman had the comment earlier about the
Right.
construction project.
Right.
It's very similar in that there's a finite amount of money for
Right.
these, with these funds. And if we're going to pick up something, then something's got, I mean, we're gonna do horse trading here. And figure out if we're gonna do that, then something's gotta come off the list. And how do we balance that? How do we prioritize that? How does it fit in that way? And I do want to piggyback, and nobody knew I was going to say this, but it's 2 weeks on the job. But the work that Jill's done and Steve and the team, I'm blown away in the thoughtful, deliberate planning that went into the use of these funds. And the reason I say that is I'm going to ask you later to help me with this, because I promised Marvin I agreed to be part of a presentation at the OASBO State Conference about ESSER funds and avoiding the fiscal cliff. This is it. I mean, so it just all fits together. And so when she showed me the presentation, I told him, like, there's a lot of stuff we're going to borrow because the work's already been done, and it's wonderful.
Well,
it's great.
Well
so
Yeah, we have the answer. How do we avoid the fiscal cliff?
well, Jill's going to help me figure it out. I may have to pay for lunch to do it.
Great job.
Yeah, very good.
Very well done.
I have a question. So I saw on there Dreambox and Lexia. So I've said this before, so I have 4 kids in the district. My younger kids use that. And I know during, distance learning, everyone felt pretty burnt out with it. But I will say, as a parent, mine have different learning abilities. I personally have loved those 2 things. And I know in the past, there have been some summers where my children were still able to log on, which was great because we've done summer school, but we've never qualified for extended school services with their IEPs. I noticed it was on with ESSER funds, and I noticed how much we paid.
Yes.
So are we able to use them this summer, those apps?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
With that being said, I was thinking, I had to ask last year if we could use them. Maybe just make it known to people that we could use it, because if we're spending that kind of money, I know not every kid loves going on it. Sure. I kind of give it incentives to my children.
Yeah.
And it's easy, like I don't have to think of summer school options on my own. Like I feel like, nope, you can't do that until you do 10 minutes on Dreambox. When the ESSER funds runs out, do you know if
the teacher's clapping for you?
If we'll continue, my children, my youngest is in 1st and my oldest is in 8th. So like, I feel like I still have quite a few years, like 4 more years of elementary school. Do you know if forecasting, would that be something that would be in our budget after ESSER funds run out?
Yeah, so we will definitely be having those discussions and have already started them. Typically what that looks like is, and this happened actually from the CARES Act ESSER 1 money, where we had a lot more digital resources that we looked at usage reports and we did surveys with teachers. How are you using it and which ones do you want to keep? And so, to justify those types of purchases, we just want to make sure we're looking at the utilization and, is the data aligning with some of the other things that we're seeing in the classroom, and getting some feedback from teachers. But absolutely, we think it's a great resource. And so, if we want to continue those efforts, then we would work it into our curriculum budget.
I just think making it known to families that they can use it during the summer. Since you're paying for it.
Yeah. I didn't like your idea of giving tips. Like, here's how you can incorporate it into summer.
You want to go to the pool?
Yeah.
Believe me, there's plenty of things they have to do before they can go to school.
Okay, I'm gonna pivot to number 4. Is that okay?
We can do that.
Can you do it in 6
Said you
minutes?
could do it in 30 seconds.
This will be
30 seconds.
This will be the only one and only time I'll be able to do this. So, we got some, we spent some, and we got some left over.
I hope we have a lot left over.
That I sold out from a mentor of mine. But real quick, I do want to publicly thank Michelle White and the entire treasurer's office team for holding the fort down until I could get here March 1st. So it's been a wild first 2 weeks. I'm not laughing, it's a good thing. I'm energized by this, and seeing the stuff that we're doing, and there's a lot of potential that we have, and it's mapping it out. It's being very thoughtful, deliberate, and planning this. You have the financial report. I could talk about it Thursday. Looking at the time, it's a little bit late. You'll see some just minor changes. What I did on the cover sheet, I think that was probably the biggest change. And this is what I did. There were some things you had before that I took off. There's some things here And I linked them to the specific board policies that dictate why they're on here. Just, we're gonna have conversations about those going forward, to see if that's something we might need to change. Like, for example, that's just one, I think, and Daphne and I had a conversation about one of these, the disbursement sum reports. It's a check register. The checks have been issued, they've been cut, they've been sent to people. So there really isn't anything we can do about it if you don't like it, because the checks are, they're in the mail. So that's just one of those things. It's not driven by ORC. It's really our own policies that dictate why those are on there. I will tell you, as you look at the 89-page report, one sheet, that's it. I mean, this is it. Everything that we do, when you think of, the board's roles in terms of policy appropriations, 5-year forecast, it's this monthly variance report. I've modified it from what was there before. I spent time looking at it and looking at expenses by month for the last 5 years and analyzing how this is, it's a timing issue. What do our expenses look like? Or because of COVID and the pandemic we've been in the last 2 years, is last year a year that we can really look at? It's not. It's a blip. It's an anomaly. So we're looking at, so I looked at 5 years and then modified what the monthly cash flow projections would be based on 5 years of data as opposed to the last 3, knowing that we have those outliers to look at. So we're looking at that. Things that are going to come forward, we'll move the report from being informational to being an approved financial report, working on that with staff. We've got the time with them Thursday morning to kind of map out what that process is like to get caught up on the backlog of things that they've been dealing with. So we're working on that. And then also what we'll have next month is bringing the revised 5-year forecast to the committee to talk through. So what we'll do is really get into we're going to get in the weeds on that. We're going to talk about what the assumptions are, what's driving our forecast. And it doesn't include the things that we're talking about here tonight in the future. What are we going to do with the Sr2 funds? Some things we may want to continue, but one-time funds are gone, they're gone. So we need to have those conversations as we go forward. So I'm really looking forward to that. But you've got the report if there's any questions you have. A lot of these things are timing. We got settlement advances on our tax settlement where we should get the final settlement in March. So those are just a little bit of changes. You'll see changes when it comes to foundation because the foundation, the funding formula is different. So we have higher restricted grants and aid because they used to be unrestricted. It's just a change of the line. So we're going to work through those. The expenses, the capital outlays running high compared to what we are under compared to what we thought it would be. And the reason was one of the things that Jill pointed on her spreadsheet because we earmarked funds out of ESSER to pay for the Chromebooks out of technology. So we budgeted for it in the general fund, but we were able to pick up the expense on the CARES Act. So that's why we're spending under right now. So we're doing great. Expenses were, year to date, we're 3% under budget. That's a good thing. You want to be under budget on expenses. You want to be over on revenue. That's where we are. So we're doing great.
Okay, good.
It's just 6 minutes. Is that close?
30 seconds.
It might be slightly over 30 seconds.
Okay. It's a little bit of.
Can I just add one more thing? Judy, thanks to Judy listening in, she said that the email went out about the survey on Friday, June 25th.
I did find it.
And
It
that
was in
a-
a weekly update.
Yep, and that a reminder would have gone out to anyone that didn't open the email. And she's checking to see if we sent follow-up reminders.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did we point out in this presentation that ESSER funds are reimbursed? So we don't get.
We didn't
all
get
the
a
money
pot of
upfront,
money,
do
right.
we?
Right.
Yeah, so just so everybody knows.
Oh, that's a very good point.
Yeah,
We have to submit to get the money remitted back to us.
right.
So if you're looking at the cash summary report, you may see a negative in there.
Right.
And that's because we're waiting on ODE to get us money. And there was a delay earlier
Yeah, I was
here
gonna ask
because
that.
there wasn't enough appropriation that was authorized by the legislature to give the district's funds.
Right.
What is
And
the,
that's
what is the
taken
timing?
care
What
of.
is the timing of that? I mean,
Depends.
because that really,
It
from our
depends.
cash flow standpoint, it's something
It's
that hits,
impactful.
it's impactful, right?
It varies.
Okay. They don't have a set guideline on what it, no.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Now, I'll
With
be with the
that,
grants management people from ODE tomorrow, so I will make sure I bring that up.
with that, we will adjourn our committee meeting. Thanks, everybody, for
Thanks, everybody.